Mei Lin was known only by whispers, but when investigators uncovered the first traces of her $9 billion Bitcoin maze, her name became the starting point of the most sophisticated financial manhunt the world had ever seen. Mei Lin's story began in the narrow hallway of a worn apartment complex above a noodle shop in Shenzhen. Oil from the restaurant below seeped into the stairwell, leaving the walls with a permanent sheen. Most residents barely noticed her as she slipped in and out carrying a second-hand laptop that overheated every hour. She appeared like someone destined to blend into the background, but her mind worked with a precision that set her apart from everyone around her. Numbers fascinated her. Systems fascinated her even more. While her neighbors spent evenings watching dramas, she dissected blockchain white papers she downloaded from obscure developer forums. She wasn't searching for fame or fortune at the start, she was searching for patterns. She worked as a junior financial analyst in a cramped office that felt more like a storage room than a workspace. Her supervisors relied on her to solve technical issues they didn't understand, yet they denied her every promotion. Each rejected request left a bruise, yet it also sharpened her resolve. In her loneliness, she developed a habit of studying transaction flows late at night. She often sat at her small desk facing the flickering city skyline, running simulations for no one but herself. Over time she began to notice oddities in the blockchain, transfers that shifted between wallets faster than auditors could record, and obscure smart contract chains that didn't behave like the rest. One night, while half asleep and overstimulated from coffee, she spotted something that changed everything. A predictable gap in a decentralized payment protocol allowed coins to pass through a relay node without generating the usual traceable imprint. It wasn't a flaw that made headlines or attracted developers' attention. It was the kind of issue buried under countless update logs, dismissed as a harmless quirk. But Mei Lin understood its potential immediately. If the timing of the transaction chain was manipulated and spread across dozens of relay nodes, the coins would vanish into a fog of untraceable microtransactions before reappearing in a fresh wallet. In effect, the blockchain would cleanse itself. Her discovery became an obsession. She built small tests using borrowed cloud servers, never transferring more than insignificant amounts. Each success convinced her she was standing at the edge of something transformative. The breakthrough didn't come with celebration, it came with silence. She sat at her desk, hands hovering over the keyboard, realizing she had just created the digital equivalent of a secret tunnel beneath a bank. It terrified her as much as it thrilled her. She upgraded her equipment piece by piece, selling personal belongings to purchase stronger processors and secure storage drives. Her apartment transformed into a humming workshop where wires snaked across the floor and monitors lit the room with cold blue light. No one knew what she was doing. Her landlord assumed she was engaged in harmless freelance work. Her coworkers assumed she had no life outside spreadsheets. The anonymity served her well. Over the next year, she expanded the tunnel into a labyrinth. She built clusters of wallets controlled by automated scripts, capable of shifting coins at precise intervals. She programmed silent triggers that masked irregular flows with decoys. She created offshore nodes, registered to fabricated identities, and set up tiny dormant companies with no employees and no real business functions. Everything she touched became a tool. Everything she built served one purpose: to make the flow of digital wealth invisible. Her financial situation changed subtly at first. She rented a slightly larger apartment. She replaced her weathered laptop, but the real transformation happened behind encrypted firewalls. Wallets holding millions began accumulating under her control, each locked behind layers of security only she understood. She didn't brag. She didn't spend lavishly. She didn't draw attention. Her greatest strength was her ability to remain hidden. By the end of the second year, whispers began surfacing in underground crypto forums about an unknown figure capable of moving massive sums across borders without detection. No one knew her name. No one knew her face, but the legend of a mysterious operator with perfect digital stealth began circulating quietly. And while the world slept, Mei Lin continued building, unaware that every step she took toward mastery also brought her one step closer to catastrophe. The growth of Mei Lin's underground empire did not happen with sudden explosions of wealth or dramatic announcements. It unfolded quietly, like fog spreading across a city before anyone notices the sky has changed. After she perfected her tunnel system, she began attracting attention from people who understood its value. These individuals never contacted her openly. Instead, strange transactions began appearing in her experimental wallets. Tiny deposits containing coded messages in the metadata. The messages were simple, often nothing more than a string of numbers or a cryptic symbol. But each one represented someone asking for access. Someone willing to pay for the power to move money without leaving a trace. She studied each request carefully. Most came from lone opportunists hoping to hide small fortunes accumulated through gray market deal. She rejected them. A few came from more dangerous sources, groups with digital fingerprints that suggested organized cybercrime networks. She ignored those too. Mei Lin understood that early missteps would destroy her. What she needed were clients who were greedy but discreet, powerful but cautious, desperate enough to follow her rules but careful enough not to expose her. It wasn't long before she found them. A corporate executive from Singapore, seeking to hide embezzled funds. A hedge fund manager in Dubai, needing to mask questionable overseas transactions. A European payment processor, skimming fees without regulatory approval. These were not criminals in the traditional sense, but people operating close enough to illegality to require her services. She provided access through a system of temporary wallet keys that expired after each cycle. No one knew her identity. No one could contact her directly. Communication happened only through blockchain metadata in timed deposits. As more money flowed through her system, the patterns she once studied now moved beneath her command. Coins pulsed through her labyrinth like blood through a circulatory system. One wallet split into 20. Those 20 passed funds into 100 more. The amounts grew, then shrank, then grew again, until even blockchain analysts assumed they were seeing corrupted data or random noise. Her influence stretched far beyond what she originally intended. Criminal groups started noticing certain Bitcoin movements were impossible to trace and seemed to disappear into nothing. Rumors formed around the mysterious network. Some believed it was run by a rogue government agency. Others insisted it was an elite hacking consortium hiding its stolen wealth. A few whispered that it was the creation of a single person, someone with a genius for exploiting digital shadows. No one believed such a person could operate alone, but the myth began taking shape anyway. By the time the first $1 billion passed through her system, even Mei Lin felt disbelief. She watched the numbers appear on her dashboard with a cold detachment, as if they belonged to someone else. She avoided touching the money directly, transferring only small, calculated portions to her personal holdings. The rest moved through clients' cycles, earning her a percentage so small it seemed insignificant compared to the total volume. That was her strategy: low profile, massive scale. She expanded her infrastructure to accommodate the growing demand. New offshore servers were acquired using forged identities. International hosting providers received payments from accounts that were shut down immediately afterward. She created backdoors into public blockchain nodes, enabling her scripts to operate with higher priority during peak congestion. All of this happened without a single human conversation. Her world was code and keys, triggers and timestamps. Despite her caution, the scale of her operation began to create ripples. Auditors in financial institutions noticed unusual wash patterns. Cybersecurity experts studying money laundering patterns observed anomalies they couldn't explain. International regulators compared notes and realized enormous sums of Bitcoin were moving through channels that technically shouldn't exist. But each time they attempted to trace a transaction, it dissolved into meaningless fragments before they could map the chain. Everyone searching for the truth felt as if they were chasing a phantom, and at the center of the phantom's shadow stood a woman in a quiet apartment, surrounded by humming servers, believing she had built something unstoppable. She didn't realize that her masterpiece was already drawing the kind of attention no one could evade forever. The small mistake that would eventually unravel Mei Lin's empire didn't announce itself with alarms or obvious warnings. It slipped into her system quietly, an overlooked remnant of an old test wallet she had created months before her network reached its peak. She had used that wallet only once during an early experiment, then meant to delete it entirely. But buried between thousands of automated wallet generations, it remained dormant, forgotten, unremarkable, and seemingly harmless. The danger, however, came from something she could not control: time. As her network expanded and automated bots multiplied wallet addresses by the thousands, one of her scripts mistakenly reactivated that old test wallet. It processed a cluster of microtransactions that should have blended into the noise, but they didn't. Instead, they appeared as a faint anomaly, an unusual rhythm in the torrent of blockchain activity. It wasn't even suspicious enough for most analysts to notice. But in the UK, a young cybercrime investigator with a habit of reviewing obscure patterns caught sight of the irregularity during a routine data sweep. The investigator wasn't looking for a global laundering scheme. He was looking for minor coding exploits used by amateur scammers. Yet the anomaly seemed too deliberate, too symmetrical, to be random. It reappeared several times over the next week, each time connected indirectly to the same dormant wallet. Curiosity turned into focus. He flagged the anomaly, ran a cluster mapping program, and discovered that this wallet linked faintly to dozens of others. Hidden among these links was a trail pointing toward a shell company registered in London with no website, no employees, and filings that made no financial sense. The company ledger showed minimal activity, almost none. But the blockchain trail told a different story. Logs from an early version of her laundering network. The encryption was advanced, almost impenetrable. But inside that complex shield was a tiny flaw. While rilling her system, Mei Lin had updated her encryption method several times, and that particular server held a version that hadn't been fully patched. Experts worked day and night, gradually peeling away the encryption. The breakthrough came when they discovered that the server's timestamps aligned perfectly with the anomalies the investigator had found. They cracked the final layer, revealing fragments of pathing routes, wallet clusters, and relay node movements. It wasn't a full map of her operation, but it was enough to recognize the architecture of something far larger. Patterns repeated across continents, revealing a structure too organized to belong to a single criminal group. Investigators cross-referenced the data with global Bitcoin flows and discovered that nearly $9 billion had passed through similar pathways in the past few years. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a system. For the first time, Mei Lin's invisible network took on a visible shape. A multinational task force quietly formed around the discovery. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Records were restricted to only the highest-ranking analysts. The world at large still believed these irregular flows were digital noise. But in a handful of government offices, the picture had shifted. They were no longer looking for a glitch. They were hunting a mastermind. Mei Lin had always promised herself she would never set foot in the United Kingdom. It was one of the few countries whose cybercrime divisions had shown a growing capacity to identify blockchain irregularities. She spent years ensuring her digital footprint never brushed against its networks. But her system had grown too large, too complex, and too intertwined with powerful clients for her to avoid every risk forever. One of those clients, a figure who controlled a vast, unregulated digital marketplace, demanded a final transfer routed personally through one of her secure vaults in London. It was a reckless request, but declining it would have triggered an even greater threat. She calculated every possibility, weighed every risk, and convinced herself it would be a short, controlled trip. She believed she could slip in and out unnoticed. She arrived at Heathrow using a forged identity that had passed dozens of automated checks before. The passport was flawless, the biometric data carefully crafted, the history consistent. Yet what she didn't know was that investigators had already connected fragments of her network to that same identity weeks earlier. They had no face to match it with, no evidence to justify an arrest, but they tagged the associated credentials with a silent alert. The moment she passed through the automated immigration gate, her presence was registered deep in an internal database, watched by the task force monitoring the mysterious Bitcoin anomalies. Officials did not approach her immediately. They watched instead. They tracked her movements from the airport to a rented vehicle and then to an upscale hotel near the financial district. Surveillance teams rotated positions to avoid detection. She remained careful, never using public Wi-Fi, never staying out long, always checking reflections in passing windows. She sensed the city felt heavier than she expected, as if pressure pressed on her from all sides. But she attributed it to jet lag and nerves. Her objective was simple: reach the underground vault, verify the client's transfer, and exit the country. She scheduled her visit late at night when the building's foot traffic was minimal. The vault was located beneath an old corporate building that had been repurposed into a data storage facility. Few people used the lower levels anymore, but Mei Lin had rented a secure bay years earlier under a separate identity through layers of shell corporations. It was meant to be a temporary node, yet it had become a critical piece of her architecture. When she arrived, she entered through a service corridor, using an access card she believed was untraceable. She descended 2 levels underground, reached the vault bay, and unlocked the reinforced door. The cold air inside carried the familiar hum of servers. She felt calmer here than anywhere else. Machines were predictable, people were not. She initiated the transfer sequence, checked the automation scripts, and ran a quick diagnostic. Everything looked stable. In her focus, she didn't notice the subtle shift occurring above her. The vault had a pressure-sensitive emergency system, connected to the building's outdated security grid, something she had hulled when she initially scouted the location. As she stepped deeper into the room, the system registered a weight pattern that matched a forced entry signature. It silently pinged the building's monitoring service, which forwarded the alert to local law enforcement. The alert escalated to the cyber task force when the vault's registered address flashed under a list of flagged shell companies. By the time Mei Lin completed her work and prepared to leave, the street above was already sealed. Unmarked vehicles lined the block. Officers positioned themselves in alleys, stairwells, and loading docks. As she walked toward the stairwell exit, she noticed a faint echo of footsteps that didn't belong to the empty building. Instinct pushed her to quicken her pace, but it was too late. When she reached the ground level, the door swung open to a corridor filled with armed officers moving with precision. Every escape route collapsed around her. Her arrest happened without struggle, without drama, without a single word exchanged. In those final moments, she didn't attempt to run. She simply stood still, realizing the empire she had built with such care had been undone by a forgotten wallet, an old server, and a single trip she should never have taken. The courtroom buzz that followed Mei Lin's arrest faded quickly, replaced by the steady grind of investigation and legal proceedings. She was transferred to a high-security facility, where she spent her days isolated from the digital world she once commanded. The sudden stillness inside her cell contrasted sharply with the constant hum of servers that had surrounded her for years. She no longer had access to the network she created, yet its movements continued without her guidance. Outside the prison walls, her name became international news, her story portrayed as a cautionary tale of genius turned criminal. But investigators soon discovered that the truth was more complicated than any headline could capture. Analysts from several countries pored over the seized servers, expecting to find a complete blueprint of her operation. Instead, they uncovered something far more unsettling. The logs contained fragmented code structures, incomplete transaction maps, and half-finished scripts, like pieces of a vast puzzle scattered deliberately out of order. It became clear that her network didn't operate from a single command center. Rather, it ran through a decentralized mesh of automated processes that no longer required her input. The system she had built was functioning as if it had developed autonomy. Funds continued to move around the world long after her arrest, splitting into smaller portions, scattering across new addresses, and recombining in unpredictable patterns. The more experts examined the code, the more they realized how deeply it had evolved. Mei Lin had designed it to adapt to changing blockchain conditions, creating new routes whenever old ones grew too congested. Over years of updates and modifications, her scripts had developed layers of conditional logic that responded to transaction analytics in real time. To an investigator, it looked less like a money laundering tool and more like a living organism capable of migrating to survive. Governments attempted to shut down the active nodes, but whenever one path was blocked, another seemed to open somewhere else. $3 billion worth of assets remained trapped in perpetual motion, unreachable and unredeemable. Inside her cell, Mei Lin received heavily redacted reports about the court's findings. She learned that her name was now tied to a system she could no longer control. What unsettled investigators even more was the existence of encrypted gaps that hinted at a hidden structure beneath everything they had uncovered. These gaps linked to rumors found in underground forums about a secondary identity, a persona supposedly created by Mei Lin before her empire reached its peak. According to whispers, she had prepared a contingency plan, a buried cache containing the master keys to every transaction ever processed through her network. If it existed, it would be worth billions. If released, it could expose some of the world's most powerful individuals who had used her services. The search for the cache became a global obsession. Task forces scanned offshore servers, combed through abandoned nodes, analyzed encrypted disks found in her old apartments.